Welcome to today's webinar on developing your application workbook for the Community Resilience Centers, or CRC program Round 2. This is a grant program under the California Strategic Growth Council, or SGC. This training is hosted by Civix Consulting Group, which is the third-party technical assistance provider working with SGC on supporting applicants as they prepare for Round 2 of the program. This is an overview of what we'll be covering in today's training. I'll provide some details on the CRC program and an overview of the application workbook. Then I will discuss the requirements for both planning and implementation grants. Next, I'll pull up the application workbook and do a live demonstration on how to complete it. And we'll wrap up with some tips on building a strong application workbook and key program dates. So SGC's CRC program will fund new construction and upgrades of neighborhood level resilience centers to provide programs and services that build community resilience year-round and during climate and other emergencies. For Round 2 of the program, $55 million in funding is available for planning grants and implementation grants. While this training will cover both grant types, when there is a requirement specific to one grant type, you'll see a P or an I icon on the slide indicating to which grant type the requirement applies. Otherwise, the requirements discussed today apply to both grant types. In terms of eligibility, lead applicants must be a public or local agency, nonprofit organization, special district, joint powers authority, California Native American tribe, public utility or local publicly owned utility, or a mutual water company. While all communities in California are eligible, this program prioritizes under-resourced, rural, unincorporated, and tribal communities, and those communities will receive additional points during application review. While this training focuses on requirements for the application workbook, for details on other program requirements, please review the final Round 2 program guidelines on SGC's website. The application workbook is a required component of your CRC application. The full application is open via the submittable platform. CRC is providing all application components via a Google Drive linked in the submittable application. You can download an application workbook template from CRC's Google Drive, and I'll show you how to do that later in the session. After downloading the template, I'd recommend saving the file to your working folder so you can keep all of your application materials organized. Before starting to edit the workbook, make sure you read the instructions and read all of the sheets included in the workbook to familiarize yourself with the content, and then save frequently as you're working. Applicants should be prepared to dedicate a good bit of time to completing the application workbook in detail, as it will provide the basis for the scope of work that is adapted into your grant agreement with SGC if awarded. The intent of the application workbook is to demonstrate applicant management and financial capacity to oversee, manage, and implement CRC grant activities. So you'll want to show how your project activities align with the requirements of the program and the intent of the program, which is to build local climate and community resilience, and describe all costs at each of the project phases, which we'll discuss later in the training. Keep in mind that the application workbook is one of the key deliverables that the application reviewers will use to understand what your project is and how it meets program requirements. So make sure that your workbook is clear and comprehensive. Now I'm going to discuss specific application workbook requirements to keep in mind as you develop your work plan and budget. Your work plan and budget, which is one sheet in the application workbook, must reflect all proposed grant activities, line item costs, cost categories, funding sources, and proposed deliverables by grant phase. Costs should include full and part-time staff, participant compensation, supplies and equipment costs, contractor costs, travel costs, and training costs as applicable. Equipment here is defined as tangible personal property that has a useful life of more than 1 year and remains a standalone movable asset rather than becoming part of a building or other real property. Once an item is attached or incorporated such that its removal would damage or impair the item's intended function, it is no longer considered equipment. Instead, it's treated as construction material or real property. And then lastly, a note here on participant compensation. Participant compensation is an eligible cost only as compensation for work that contributes toward grant implementation. So for example, a door prize to draw attention to meetings would not be an eligible cost, but compensation for participation in a workshop where feedback was provided would be eligible. Eligible costs are direct and indirect costs that can be tied to eligible grant activities incurred during the grant period and are specified in the grant agreement. Direct costs are costs directly tied to the implementation of the grant agreement and are organized into 3 categories: administration costs, project costs, and program delivery costs. Administration costs are costs associated with the planning and management of the grant, as well as costs associated with reporting and capacity building to ensure compliance with the grant agreement. These costs include costs associated with grant invoicing and reporting, meetings with SGC staff, trainings, peer-to-peer learning with other grantees, and reconciling the grant funding. Implementation grant applicants must set aside a minimum of 3% of their total award to cover costs associated with evaluation, which is a distinct phase shown in the work plan and budget for implementation grants. Project costs are costs that are directly related to the planning and development of the physical CRC project. So that includes your CRC facility, campus amenities, and partner sites. Project costs include pre-development and implementation costs. So pre-development costs are costs to prepare and plan for the future construction of a CRC, which may include community engagement, planning, engineering, architectural or other design work, environmental impact reports or other assessments, or appraisals, legal expenses, or easements. Implementation costs are costs of capital projects, which include site preparation, basic infrastructure, retrofits, and construction costs for the CRC facility and campus amenities. For implementation grants, a minimum of 51% of the grant award must be spent on project costs, including pre-development and implementation costs. Program delivery costs involve costs associated with planning for and implementing the CRC program and program requirements. These costs may include costs for planning activities like data collection, curriculum development, or other plan preparation, costs for project management, including staff time to develop the community engagement plan, and staff time for developing and reviewing procurement documents. For each grant type, the development of specific plans or deliverables required by the program, like the collaborative governance structure, will be tracked as program delivery costs. Indirect costs are not directly tied to the grant, but are necessary for the general operation of the organization. So these may include personnel costs associated with administrative, supervisory, legal, and executive staff, and operating expenses and equipment not included as part of direct project costs, such as accounting, budgeting, audits, business services, IT, janitorial, rent, utilities, etc. Lead applicants and partners may charge indirect costs at a rate of up to 15% of direct costs, with 2 exceptions. Indirect costs may not be applied to implementation costs, and they may not be applied to equipment purchases with a per unit cost of $5,000 or more. And I'll show you how this is accounted for in the application workbook. California Native American tribes and tribally owned nonprofits may use a higher indirect cost rate. SGC will accept a tribal applicant's federally negotiated rate that is current at the time of application. If the tribe does not have a federally negotiated rate, they will be able to submit a modification to receive a rate higher than 15% in their application. Both grant types are subject to the 15% maximum for indirect costs, with the exception as noted in the previous slide. Implementation grants are subject to other cost cap requirements, including a minimum of 3% of the total award for evaluation, a minimum of 51% of the total award for project costs. A maximum of 20% of direct costs may be spent on pre-development costs and should be spent during that pre-development phase. And project costs at partner sites cannot exceed 8% of the total grant award. And this is all accounted for in your implementation grant application workbook. SGC recommends that planning and implementation grants include up to 10% of the total award for contingency. However, this is not a requirement. Ineligible costs include costs exceeding the cost caps I discussed above, expenses and activities incurred before the grant term begins or after it ends, participant incentives such as door prizes, direct cash benefits, or subsidies, which are not related to specific community work products, lobbying, commission fees, damage judgments arising from the acquisition, construction, or equipping of a facility, real estate brokerage fees or expenses, or commission-based compensation related to the acquisition or disposition of real property, and acquisition and or maintenance of fossil fuel powered appliances, building systems, and infrastructure, such as diesel generators and gas powered appliances. Out-of-state travel is not reimbursable under this grant, except for tribes whose project land extends across state lines. For planning grants, grant funds may not be used for costs associated with construction, renovation, or land acquisition. For a complete list of ineligible costs, please refer to the program guidelines. Leverage funding is funding from non-CRC program sources that support activities that are integrated into the overall CRC project. Leverage funds are not required for this program. However, leverage funds will be required if the expected total project costs exceed more than 10% of the requested award amount. In this case, the applicant must submit supporting documentation with the final application package. During application review, applications with funding gaps in excess of 10% will not pass the program threshold review stage. Now I'm going to walk you through a demonstration of how to download the template and complete your application workbook. So the round 2 application is hosted in Submittable. There will be a link to the application workbook template in Submittable, as shown in the screenshot here, which will take you to Google Drive where the template is hosted. So I'm going to pull that up so you can see what it looks like. So the link in Submittable will take you here. Once in Google Drive, you will download the template through clicking on this icon here or going to File, Download. The file will download as a zipped folder, so open the folder to access the Excel template. And I'm going to pull up the Excel template now so you can see what that looks like. Once you have the template downloaded, save a copy to your working folder. I'm going to walk through the planning grant workbook for this first demo. So first, get familiar with the structure of the workbook. The workbook has 9 sheets or tabs that you can navigate to at the bottom here. Many of these are reference tabs that do not require input. Applicants will need to complete tabs 2, 3, and 4. So the first sheet I'm showing here provides the applicant instructions, which give an overview of each of the tabs and any definitions you might want to refer back to. Read the instructions in full before you start editing your workbook. The second sheet is your applicant and project summary. This workbook is protected, so some cells that have a formula or instructions will be locked for editing, and applicants will only be able to edit cells where information is required from them. For example, you can see here that the total CRC funds requested cell is locked. I can't click on it. That's because that information will be pulled from your budget and work plan once it's complete. But here for project proposal name, I can click on that. It's editable. So this is where the applicant will want to enter information. So you'll enter information about your project description, and coordinates for your proposed CRC facility. Then for the lead applicant, as well as partners, you will enter some organization details and contact information here. Throughout this workbook, there may be instances where a cell includes a drop-down menu with a choice of responses. So for example, under applicant type, applicant type here, you would select the correct applicant type from the drop-down. Before I move to the work plan and budget, I want to highlight that tabs 6, 7, and 8 are samples of the applicant and project summary, work plan and budget, and the leverage funding tabs. These are here for applicants to reference as they build out their workbooks. So here is the sample applicant and project summary tab. You can see how this example applicant filled out the required information. Now let's look at tab 3, which is your CRC work plan and budget. This is where most of the applicant's time should be focused. You'll see at the top there are a few summary tables. These will update based on what the applicant enters below and will be locked for editing. These summary tables include details on the threshold requirements or cost caps. And if a cost cap is not met, you'll see the respective cell in a yellow highlight. And I'll show you an example of what that looks like in a minute. So the first table shows a budget summary by cost categories. You can see here we have total direct costs, and then your total indirect costs are calculated through this indirect cost calculator. This here is set at a default of 15% indirect cost rate. If you want to use a lower indirect cost rate, you can make that adjustment in the cell here. So for example, I changed to 14%, back to 15%. Like I mentioned earlier, tribes and tribal entities may use a higher indirect cost rate. And then we have a budget summary table, which shows the totals for any leverage funding and if you have a funding gap. These tables here are what applicants will complete with all direct costs. And then the second table will include all equipment costs. Again, notice that you are able to edit any white cell while the gray cells should not be edited, and they have a formula. I'm going to switch over to the sample tab so you can see a completed example. Under direct cost category, you will use the drop down to select the appropriate cost category, so administration, project, or program delivery. Then you will select the direct cost subtype. Again, refer to the instructions in this workbook and the program guidelines if you need to double check your cost categories. In the activity or cost description column, you will write a description of the activity or cost. Under deliverables, list the deliverables that will be created as a result of the activity. And then these columns are where you will enter in dollars the total cost, the total CRC funds requested, and any leverage funding. This funding gap column here will auto-calculate. It has a formula. So if the total cost does not exceed the total CRC funds requested plus any leverage funding, then the funding gap will be 0. For the dates columns, use the drop-down here to select approximate start and end dates for your activities. The lead column is where you will indicate who on the team is responsible for this activity. So this drop down here will auto-populate based on the lead applicant and partners you list in tab 2, your applicant and project summary. And then there is an open column to add any other responsible parties, like other partners or contractors. This process is similar for the equipment table, which I'll show here. So this is your equipment table, except here you will enter the cost per unit and the number of units, which will be used to calculate the total cost. If you're seeing highlighted cells in the summary tables, after you've entered all of your budget information, you'll need to review the cost caps and revise your budget. The last tab here is leverage funding. If you don't have any leverage funding, you can skip this tab. For those projects with leverage funding, applicants will need to fill out the table with details on the leverage funding source, amounts, the funding term, and any supporting documentation uploaded to Submittable. The totals in this table here should match the total funding submitted in tab 3. Otherwise, you will see a highlight in this cell here. The required deliverables list provides a summary of CRC grant program requirements that are due at each phase of the grant term. While this tab is for reference only, applicants may choose to track the status of each item in this status column if they wish. The last tab that we need to talk about is the fully burdened rate calculator. This is an optional tool that applicants may use to calculate costs for grant-funded staff, including wages and fringe benefits. You can see there is an example in the first row, which shows a fully burdened rate plus cost of living adjustment of $40.92 per hour. Now I'm going to pull up the implementation grant workbook so we can talk through some slight differences there. The general structure of the implementation grant workbook is similar to the planning grant workbook. I'm just going to highlight some differences briefly. So on the applicant and project summary tab, if your project includes partner sites, you can enter the site name and coordinates here. Tab 3, your CRC work plan and budget, is slightly different than the planning grant workbook. This tab here includes a summary table for partner site costs, if applicable. And then in the tables below, where the applicant will fill out their activities, applicants will enter direct costs by phase. So we have the pre-development phase, which has a yellow background, implementation, which has a blue background, and evaluation, which has a green background. The pre-development and implementation phases also include separate tables for equipment, similar to the planning grant workbook. The implementation grant workbook also has an additional column, this proposed sites for activities. Choose a location from the drop-down menu for each cost. Costs that are off-site, such as door-to-door canvassing, can be assigned to CRC facility and campus amenities. Project costs associated with partner sites must be assigned to the partner sites option in the drop-down menu. And then all costs in the evaluation phase will be tracked as administration. So you'll see the drop down here under direct cost category only has administration as an option for evaluation phase. I'm going to switch over to the sample tab so we can take a look at an example. Like I mentioned earlier, the summary tables will have a yellow highlight if one of those cost caps aren't met. So for example, for implementation grants, a minimum of 3% of the total award must go to evaluation. If I delete the CRC funds requested in the evaluation tab, in the evaluation phase, and scroll up to the summary tables, now you can see the highlights in the summary tables for evaluation. If you're seeing highlighted cells after you've entered all of your budget information, that's a flag that you need to review your cost caps and revise your budget. Before uploading your completed workbook into Submittable, make sure that all of the tabs are completed in full. You don't have any highlighted cells in your workbook, and make sure you save the file with the correct naming convention. This is supplied in the Submittable link, but it's your lead applicant name _ proposal name _ PG or IG application workbook. Now, before we close out the training, I'm going to leave you with some relevant scoring criteria and other considerations to keep in mind as you build out your application workbook. If an application meets all program thresholds, SGC staff and an interagency review panel will review and score the application using the scoring criteria in the program guidelines. How well your application workbook meets some of these criteria will have a significant impact on your overall application score. Some relevant areas of the scoring criteria to keep in mind include making sure the activities you define in the work plan and budget align with your vision statement and with the overall CRC program and grant objectives. For implementation grants, you'll need to make sure that your capital projects align with the CRC strategies in the guidelines and make a clear connection between those activities and outcomes for priority populations. When identifying roles and responsibilities in the work plan, leverage the technical expertise on your team, including partner organizations. Lastly, your activities and timelines should be reasonable and feasible to accomplish within the grant term. One note on project feasibility scoring: implementation grant applicants must have a funding gap of 5% or less to be eligible for full project feasibility points. To close, keep your reviewer in mind as you build out your work plan and budget. You will be more familiar with your project than the reviewer will be, so make sure that your work plan and budget clearly narrate how the proposed activities meet the requirements and the intention of the CRC program and will lead to local climate resilience. Your activity descriptions and deliverables should be detailed and specific enough to show reviewers how your activities advance project goals and objectives. For deliverables, think about how you intend to document the outcomes or the final product of each activity. Ensure your cost estimates and timelines are reasonable. Can the activities reasonably be accomplished within the grant term? For cost estimates, you may want to revisit other project budgets that the lead applicant or partners have completed, or consider initial conversations with contractors for cost estimates. When in doubt, start by breaking your activities into smaller tasks and assign hours or costs to each. Lastly, refer back to your application narrative to ensure that your work plan and budget matches the project as you describe it in the application narrative. Review and update your application workbook as your application progresses. Some important dates to keep in mind. The Round 2 application period opened on July 2nd. You can review Round 2 materials, including the Notice of Funding Availability, the program guidelines, and the full application link on SGC's website, which we'll show on the following slide. The application period for planning grants closes on September 4th, while the application period for implementation grants closes on September 25th. SGC will then review applications with Round 2 awards anticipated by spring 2027. If you have any questions about the workbook or other program elements, please scan the QR code shown here to submit your questions to the CRC Frequently Asked Questions form. A spreadsheet will A spreadsheet with the answered questions is linked in the same form. This concludes the application workbook training for round 2 of the Strategic Growth Council's Community Resilience Centers program. Thank you.